stage, right? They declared him to be, repeat, their first national hero. And he sits aside some interesting, sometimes scoundrelly, like, I don't know if I'll offend anybody, like Mr. Bustamante and so on, but also Norman Manley, who also had defects on the racial issue. His court, Norman Manley's court, was very defective in relation to the issue of race and blackness. So Garvey's not surrounded necessarily by the best set of people, but he's there and he's important to Jamaica and Jamaicans. But his grandest work was not done in Jamaica at all. In fact, it was done in the United States of America, and a lot of the material on Garvey speaks about those American years. He went there first in 1916, having founded the UNIA in Jamaica in 1914, and struggled with those years, in those years, to make it work. And he went, as I say, to the States in 1916. We went on a speaking tour, intending to raise money to go back to Jamaica and establish something like the Tuskegee Institute or some part of the Tuskegee Institute. He was interested in industrial training for black people, and that's what he went to the States to raise money for. In the States, his ideas and his personality caught fire, and his movement blossomed and grew into the wonderful worldwide thing that he intended. He intended to be a worldwide, universal entity when he set it up in Jamaica in 1914, but it wasn't happening in Jamaica. He went to the States.
Disconnected.
He went to the States, and it was happening, and it happened big. And out of the States, he influenced the rest of the Caribbean so that there are branches of the UNIA all over the Caribbean, with Cuba having most of them, believe it or not. Cuba we don't tend to think of as a black society, but in fact it's a majority black place. And Cubans flocked to Garvey's banner in the 1920s. He influenced South America, he influenced Central America, he influenced Africa, and he influenced Europe, and of course North America, including the United States and Canada. So this movement was massive. Over 2,000 branches, at the very least, worldwide. So the American years deserve the attention that they got. But the Jamaican years also matter. It is out of Jamaica that Marcus Garvey was generated and nursed. He came from Jamaican artisan peasant stock, two biggish words. Artisan means qualified workman, right? And his father was a stonemason, as well as being a poor man who owned a fair amount of land. And we call everybody worldwide who owns and controls a little piece of land a peasant. There's a technical term for my grandfather and right, on both sides, right? They own a bit of land in the country, and that's how they made their living. So peasants. They can be small ones that combine working their own land with working for somebody else. And then there's whole heap of people who don't have no land at all, who work on estates or work for other people and so on. Garvey came from a part of this community that owned land, right? And his father came out of maroon stock. His father came out of the tradition of Jamaican struggle. So that in 1865 and in the period before 1865, when Jamaica was going through various difficulties. Why am I mentioning 1865? Anybody?
Because there was the freedom.
Huh?
From the British, they freed, quote-unquote, freed black people around the world.
No. In Jamaica, what's the significance of 1865? Every Caribbean person.
Paul Bogle.
Paul Bogle, exactly. Morant Bay Rebellion. right? That's the significant thing about 1865. And it wasn't just important to Jamaica. It actually affected the whole of the British Empire, believe it or not. The British slaughtered a whole set of people. They reported boastingly about what they had done, and then people started to object to what they had done, and it caused a whole ruckus in English society. And its impact in places like the Caribbean was that the British took the opportunity to make the societies less democratic than they were up until that point. And by democracy, I don't mean everybody being involved. I mean some people who own land and so on being part of an elective assembly. They abolished elected assemblies all over the Caribbean, excepting in Barbados in 1865. And the people who had a right then to participate in voting, very, very small. It gradually grew, and they got back to, there was never universal adult suffrage, but they got to universal adult suffrage first in Jamaica in 1944-45. Right? Now, going back to 1865, in the period before the Morant Bay Rebellion, Jamaicans were agitating about all kinds of things. Times were hard. And Garvey's uncle turns up in the records of that period of agitation. So Garvey is related to people who were in struggle long before he was born. In the period of, we don't know what they did during the period of enslavement, but in the period between enslavement and 1865, and up to Garvey's birth in 1887, we know that his people were involved in struggle, right? So, now, in addition to being in struggle, Garvey's father was a remarkable man. He was remarkable in that he had a library, and it was a good library, and he could have said to his picnic them, leave the book them alone. But he said no such thing. He encouraged them to read the books. And so Garvey, unlike most African Jamaican people, was privileged to have books in his home. Most Jamaicans at that time, poor black people, you might have had Whitaker's Almanac, you'd have had the Gleaner, and they'd use the Gleaner to wallpaper the page of the Gleaner as wallpaper inside of your house or even hut, and so on. So you'd have had the Bible and an almanac and next to nothing else, reading-wise. Yeah? And that's how it was. Garvey wasn't like that. Garvey was lucky in two other ways, family-wise. His mother and one of my colleagues who used to live here, Professor Winston James, has a remarkable book which he calls Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia. But inside of it, and also in that film that none of us like, on Garvey, it's, what's the title of it? It's, huh? Say again? No, that's a book. Film. That Robert Hill is connected with another life. Anybody? I can't remember the title. But interestingly, in that film, Winston has a little part, and in what he says during that film is...
Just for information, we'll be actually showing that film next week.
Okay, there you go. So everybody can come and see it.
Come see the inaccuracies, and we hope to correct some of the inaccuracies.
Yes. It's very problematic film. It's full of good information, but against that good information is a whole set of wicked political statements about Garvey, right? So, in that film, Winston James, who used to live here, and used to be my friend, talks about Garvey's mother really valorizing her son. She says to him, "My son, you're going to be somebody, you're going to be somebody," right? And she encouraged him to think of himself as somebody who was going to do something in the world, right? And that matters. It matters that mothers valorize their children, right? You've got to get them to read, you've got to get them to attend to their lessons, you've got to get them to behave properly, and you've got to tell them that they are on this earth to do and be studied, right? And Garvey's mother did that. So he has a father giving him learning through the books, and he has a mother saying, boy, you're going to be studied. And then they appointed a godfather who was a printer. He had a printery in St. Anne's Bay, and he had one in the neighbouring parish, St. Mary. Right? St. Anne and St. Mary side by side, Jamaicans will know. And Garvey's father, in addition, was a remarkable man in all kinds of ways, including that he loved a little bit too much going to law. We call them litigious, and if you go to law a lot and lose, you're in trouble. Because law is an expensive business. If you go to law, you better win. Right? And Garvey's father was sufficiently litigious that it actually affected his income. It actually affected, he had to sell land to pay for losing cases and so on. So from being a man with some land, he ended up towards the end of his life having very little indeed. So Garvey left school at 14. We know the year he was born, 1887, right? So in 1901, Garvey was in his godfather's place learning the printing trade. And he learned it well. Please, my brothers and sisters, understand the importance of printing and understand the importance of the fact that Garvey was a master printer. Why is it important? You know, these days we're teaching our children computers and coding and that kind of stuff. And the reason we're doing that is that the computer is now an extraordinarily important tool in world culture, right? There was a time when the printed page and books were that important. And to be a master of printing, a master of the making of the printed word, was an extraordinarily important talent to have. And Garvey didn't just have it as a talent, he had it in a masterly way. So from as early as Garvey, right, and ran the newspaper in Spanish, which was the language of the place. Audience in Panama, in a place called Colon, from the Caribbean. So they could read English, but others read Spanish. And his new. So this is a man who, wherever he went, and from very early, was doing stuff. Let's go back to Jamaica. We have him born, going to school. He's baptized a Methodist. He goes to an Anglican school, and then he ends up much later as a Roman Catholic. Right? We won't worry too much about that, but the fact they state that. So he grows up as a Methodist in rural Jamaica. In Kingston, he gets his first job. First job is in a printery. And shortly after he joins the printery, there's a strike. He is deeply involved in that strike. We're talking about a period when trade union organization, even in Britain, was close to being illegal or completely illegal. There's legislation, combination laws they call them, directed at trade unionism, right? So you're talking about activity that the state regarded as illegal and employers didn't too love. So Garvey got into one of those in a leadership position, very young man, right? But he was in this leading position in that activity. The strike went from December of one year, let us say 1908, to the January of the following year. So it lasted a few weeks, and then it was crushed. And it matters that Garvey was sufficiently good a printer that even though he should have been blacklisted and probably was for a while, he still managed a little bit later to get a job as a printer again, this time in the government printery, right? So this was a man of remarkable skills in that way. We need to understand that he got into political activity relatively early. In Jamaica, there was something called a National Club, run by somebody called Sandy Cox. In Jamaica, there was a nationalist who wasn't Jamaican, an African nationalist who wasn't Jamaican, but he came from the Bahamas, Dr. Love. And Garvey joined the organization that those people had. He was assistant secretary in Dr. Love's organization. Dr. Love's organization had a newspaper, and Garvey helped to edit and distribute that, right? So he was in at the beginning of fighting trade unionism in Jamaica, not fighting against, but fighting with, for, inside of trade unionism. So he is at the beginning of what people like to call the Jamaican workers' movement, right? So Garvey is as important as that in terms of how our history as a place, as a nation, evolves. So he travels out of the island in 1910, 1911. Then he comes back and he becomes involved in cultural activity. He's organizing elocution contests. All of us, if we're Caribbean, know what they are. You stand up and recite, and you read stuff, and you win, and you debate, and you win. Garvey was a debater. He organized debating groups and so on, and he actually participated in an island-wide debating competition in which he was placed third. He represented his parish, St. Anne, and was placed third in the whole of the island, which is fairly good. Really. Second and third is the next thing. He was placed, quite an achievement, island-wide. All right, so Garvey's was in those years the ANC of South Africa, a man called Sol Plaatje. It's not absolutely clear that they met, but they were here at the same time, and there's every reason to believe that they did meet. Also in London at that time was a Jamaican who we know less about than we should, somebody called Dr. T.E.S. Shows, who was a medical doctor, not a PhD doctor, and was also a medical missionary. So he spent time in West Africa, Nigeria and the Congo almost certainly. And he wrote. He wrote a little pamphlet called Sugar in the West Indies, which is a brilliant analysis of how the white people then organized Caribbean society, Caribbean economies in their own interest. He talks about, for example, the way in which they ran the taxation system, so that the taxation was regressive. If you owned a little piece of land, let us say you paid 2 shillings an acre, and if you own a big quantity of land, you pay all a penny and fard, which is about 1/4 of a penny per acre. And they ran the legislature, they ran the government, and set it up. No tax, but or next to no tax, but the poor black people then go and pay through the nose. Right? That's how it was. They tax food. So saltfish, which is imported, wholly per tax money. Shad and mackerel and then something, wholly per tax money, because black people ate that stuff. Right? If you go and look at the taxation on food that they ate, you will find that they came in without taxation or next to no taxation. The whole system was organized by white people for white people. A few black people crept into the system, but on the whole, they had very little power. or the Legislative Council, you might get elected to it, but when at the end of the day, it's something called the Executive Council, and the Attorney General and one or two other key officers of the state, all of whom would have tended to be white, or if they weren't white, they were sufficiently white in the head for their skin not to matter, and they would run things. So even if you were elected to the Legislative Council, you tended to have no power. It's the governor and in front them in the Executive Council who really ran things. That's how it was in the Caribbean in the time of Garvey's childhood. There were parochial boards. The parishes. How many people here from Jamaica? Another place is organized into parishes, right? Most of the other Caribbean islands are probably also like that. But those parishes have council, a bit like here. Corporation council to this. Traveling, we're in with a white woman. He says she was an Irish heiress, but in come to him senses and him say, right, I am going to stick with my own. So I'm done with the white woman. Right? So on his own account, repeat, nobody not inventing this. This is him telling his godfather that had happened, and then put the white woman beside her and beside him, and you know, put a white woman behind him and get on with living a black African life. All right. So he goes back home to Jamaica just before war. The war, First World War, starts in September of 1914. Garvey is back in Jamaica in July of 1914. And he is ready to do the great work that he proceeded to do. He does this on a basis which he actually lays out in 1914. Garvey wrote and spoke. And we have stuff that he wrote and spoke. We have stuff in the Gleaner. We have stuff that he was being observed by the state. We have what the state was saying about him. And a brother who don't too like Garvey, but is a wonderful scholar, Robert Hill, had gone around everywhere where Garvey went and collected up the documents. So we have what Garvey wrote, what the state heard Garvey speak and write down, the documents that the state presented about Garvey, his newspapers, everything. They are, as far as I understand it, 13 volumes of this size, edited by Hill, and more to come. So the work that Hill did on Garvey, Hill is not a Garveyite. Hill is a kind of a Jamesian Marxist, and he don't really like Garvey. But when he was a young man, either his father or his uncle told him, and this is me quoting Robert, either his father or his uncle told him that Garvey was important. And he proceeded to build his scholarly career on this important person whose politics he doesn't really like. Yeah? And so he's actually done remarkable work around Garvey, but it's not Garveyite work because he's not Garveyite. Okay? So that's Robert Hill. He's an advisor on that film that you are going to see next week, and the negative effect of him not liking Garvey is very evident in that film. So, Garvey goes back home. He's ready to do the work. And we say we know. In this, Garvey announces that he has for the past 10 years, so back to about 1904, roughly, he has been observing the conditions of black people here, there, and everywhere. He's decided from his observation that we are in a state of degradation everywhere, and that state of degradation arises from the effect of white power. Yeah? He calls it white injustice. And he says that the other cause of our degradation, it's a strong word, is that some Africans, who he calls educated and positioned Negroes, are not doing for the race what their education and position qualifies them to do. And if they were doing the right thing by their fellow Africans, our situation would be much better. That's what Garvey thought and said in 1914. So, and there's another element to how bad things are with us, and he also brings this out in 1914. We don't love ourselves and so on. All right, Garvey knew all of that and was telling our people that from 1914. Garvey was saying we must organize collectively, we must organize out of self-love. And out of that self-love, we must create economic stuff. Not intended to have. There's only been one director. There's an excellent, excellent sister who's come here and we've worked with her, Donna McFarlane. Unfortunately, she's ill with this very serious cancer at the moment, but they appear to have put in another very good sister as her temporary successor. I don't think she'll ever get back to do that job because the cancer that she has is a very bad one. And I'm hoping she lives long, but I don't think she'll ever be up to performing that task yet. Anyway, so what we're hoping to do is to have a session in which the director of Liberty Hall gives a guided tour online and then answers questions from people assembled here who will have been around on the tour with her of the Liberty Hall work, and then be able to ask her a question live on something that will be in it. It will happen in October, definitely. All right, so what was Garvey doing in the years, this final period now in Jamaica, between 1927, the year of the deportation, and 1934, when he decided that strategically Jamaica wasn't the place for him. He needed to be more centrally located in the world. And he couldn't be in the United States of America because the Americans wouldn't let him back in. So the center of the British Empire, London, was the place to be, and he came back here. Now, I mentioned Brodber earlier on. I said that Brodber interviewed African Jamaicans to find out what they had experienced in the moment when Garvey arrived back in Jamaica, something in 1921, or with that ship, or in 1927 when he was deported. The Gleaner says that the crowd that came out for Garvey in certainly 1927, when he came home from deportation, no crowd has ever been seen like that in Jamaica, in Kingston. This is the Gleaner, the white people, their mouthpiece, saying that. So, if anything, they're understating. And if they're understating, it just goes to show how big the crowd was, how dense. Right? African Jamaicans came out for Garvey. And Garvey was making an impression not just on African Jamaicans and not just on ordinary Africans in the Caribbean, but when that ship arrived in Cuba in 1920, the president of Cuba, who was a mixed race man, was so excited by this ship with its black captain and deputy, whatever they call it, one next down from the captain, that he came out and welcomed them and put on a banquet for Garvey and his crew and so on. The president of Cuba in 1920. Right? So people say that it's only the people from the British Caribbean living in Cuba who were impressed by and followed Garvey. Not a thing of us. All of Black Cuba. And I repeat, there were more than half of the people there. Right? All of Black Cuba was impressed. And Cuba's a funny place, you know. In the early part of the century, Africans in Cuba rose up as Africans and got shot down in abundance. And after that, and before that, the white people in Cuba thought about Africans as a menace. And maybe they still do. Because even though the Communist Party in Cuba under Fidel has instituted a kind of equality, you will find that Fidel will make speeches about women, about women's inequality. In a society where there's still inequality around race, you won't find Fidel make any speech about that. Right? You've now got it. Can't deal with it. Even though he does important things in relation to Africa. He sent troops to Africa that helped save Angola from South Africa. That showed, by defeating them, that the white people in Southern Africa were not invincible. African Cubans and white Cubans showed that in Southern Africa. And incidentally, some sensible Africans remember that. They also remember and know the importance of Haiti. When I was lecturing at UWI, the then president of South Africa, Mbeki, came and gave a speech, a special lecture. And the special lecture was on Haiti. And the subject was the importance of the Haitian Revolution to the African world and to the world. That is what Mbeki came and lectured on at UWI. And I'll tell you something else. I don't know if it's true, but he was very upset at what the Americans did to, what's his name? The president who they overthrew. Aristide. And it is said, and I have not been able to check it, that remembering what Cuba had done for the Southern African freedom movement, that Mbeki had loaded 2 planes full of arms, and that when the Americans moved against Aristide, those planes were already in the air. And that is why they moved with the indecent haste they did to remove Aristide from Haiti. Because up until that point, because Aristide had demobilized the Haitian army, he actually had no army. He had popular support, and people were prepared to come out and die for him, but they never had no arms. And what the Americans were doing was undermining the Haitian state of Aristide, sending in ill-armed, but better armed than Aristide's people, from the Domrep, which is next door. Right? We know the geography. Haiti's on the western side of that island. It's called Hispaniola, and the Dominican Republic is on the other side of it. So, across that land border, the Americans were sending in subversive forces. And it is said that this African president, Mbeki, was in the process of arming Aristide in compensation for what the Cubans had done for his movement and for Angola and so on. But came to nothing because the Americans moved, and after that, no doubt, the planes were called back. All right. Let's just wind up the story of that final period. I've told you already that he was immensely popular when he arrived back there. I told you that the Gleaner reports on this. I've told you that Dr. Erna Bodver has gone back amongst older Jamaicans and researched their experience of hearing about Garvey and coming out from all kinds of places. They talk about taking train from Kendal and Porus and other places in rural Jamaica. I don't know if you know about train. You might be too young to know that the island was once connected up by trains from Port Antonio in the east, across through Spanish Town to Kingston, Montego Bay, coming all the way down through various little places. The train came in the morning, and then it came back in the evening, and so on and so forth. And one day per week, they loaded bananas onto the trains, and the bananas were taken by train to the various ports, right? So people use those trains. They're important. We're talking about before motor trucks proper and before buses. The trains were the main thing connecting the island. That's what people used. Just as earlier they used it for Bedouin to come to town in support of Marcus Garvey, to see the great man, to see the ship. And when he came back in 27, the same thing happened. Now, Garvey got into local politics. He formed a party, the PPP. He got elected to the KSAC, the Kingston and St Andrews Corporation, which I've talked about this already, the parish council in effect. And he ran into trouble all along the line. Garvey wrote political document, a manifesto for his 1929 election, which talked about, forget what the exact phrase, but he talked about imprisoning judges who act unfairly towards ordinary Jamaicans. And they said that he was committing some crime which they dreamt up. No doubt it was somewhere on the statute book, and he was prosecuted for it and barred from the local council. So he got elected and then was disenfranchised. And that happened in the earlier part of Garvey's career in 1909, 1910. One of the men that he was closest to, somebody called Sandy Cox, got elected to the Legislative Council representing St. Thomas. And that election was overturned twice because the reactionary forces didn't like Cox, who was black and radical. Yeah? He's a doctor and able to afford to stand. That's the other thing. In Jamaica, you have to be a big man to stand in an election, right? And I discovered this myself. When I was out there, I wasn't standing for office, but we were calling demonstrations. People would come to the demonstration and then would come expecting you to give them money for food and transport. Now, where am I to get money from for food and transport for people who come on demonstration? You expect them to come on their own street. But they have been spoiled by a process that goes back into the last century, when big men with money or parties that milked the processes of development, economic contracts and so on, doing it through dons and so on, and the parties got the money from those backhanders, and they're able to fund paying for boats and rallies where people come and have fun and have a little curried wood and whatever. All of that is in play in Jamaica. It's actually very difficult to mobilize on the basis just saying that these people are corrupt. We want you to come out and, these people are passing this piece of legislation that's not in your interest. Come out and show them that you think that. Very difficult to do. So, and it was even more difficult, I would suppose, in Garvey's day. So, the first black-oriented political party was Garvey's 1929. They had a remarkable political document. Garvey talked about an opera house in Jamaica. God knows where it's going with that. But it's in there. So he was a man with a certain respect for European high culture. On the other hand, he was a man who mobilized very actively around popular culture. And he had done that in the United States of America earlier on. The UNIA in every place had cultural programs. They used jazz, they used blues, they used gospel, they used poetry. Garvey himself was a poet. He's not a great poet, but he's an inspirational poet. He writes stuff that inspires people to action, right? And so, in his time in Jamaica, we mustn't just look at what he did politically, in formal political terms. What we have to do is look also what he did culturally and how he used culture to mobilize African people. So, a very important sister called Beverly Hamilton, who unfortunately left us 3 or 4 years ago, which is a very good Garvey'ite. She did an article published in the Jamaica Journal talking about Marcus Garvey as a cultural activist in Jamaica during his period back there between 1929 and 19. I'm seeing if I can find the first page of that. Anyway, and you're not even seeing it. But what our late now ancestor Beverly Hamilton explores is the way in which Garvey, not now just Liberty Hall, but he bought or tried to buy a place called Garvey'S Park. It's still there, now probably built over, but it was a kind of a concert hall and entertainment center. And whole heap of Jamaicans who subsequently became famous, including Miss Lou and Ranny Williams, and so on, cut their teeth in Garvey's entertainment enterprises between 1929 and 1934. Don't have time to go into the details, but trust me, it is crystal clear that in terms of the making, if you will, I can't find a better word very quickly, in terms of the making of modern Jamaican popular culture, Marcus Garvey and his cultural work at Garvey'S Park is actually important to it. If Miss Lou was influenced by it, and she was, and she admits that she was, if Ranny Williams was influenced by it, and that he admits that he was, then we are right at the center of Jamaican theatre and Jamaican radio comedy and so on. And Marcus Garvey is in at the center of that. Mental and the development of that, we can't attribute all of it to it, but he paid attention to our popular local music and promoted it at Garvey'S Park. So this is a significant, genuinely significant cultural activist involved with the development of modern Jamaican popular culture, and it's important that we understand that Garvey sat at the base of it as a kind of foundational figure, and not foundation suggests inactivity. So he was an active foundation figure. The foundation was constituted or made by the active work that he was doing in relation to mobilizing poetry in Jamaican, plays in Jamaican, I should say in Jamaican Creole and Jamaican Patois, if you will, as well as in English, music, dance, and so on. All of that was powerfully in his culture program, and very well documented by our sister Beverly Hamilton. Anybody wants to read or see those articles, I'm perfectly ready and able to send them to you by email, because they're on my system here. So, because of the racism of the Jamaican social order, Garvey found it increasingly difficult to function in Jamaica. And he didn't give up. His last newspaper, called The Black Man, the first issue of that came out in Jamaica in 1929. and then he restarted it as his main paper in the UK, starting back in 1935. And it went right through to when he died. I'm lucky enough to have somebody put them together as a bound volume, and I'm lucky enough to have a copy of Marcus Garvey's Black Man, a bound volume. So it's available. We know what he was saying when he came to the UK. Garvey in the UK is a talk for another occasion, and I will offer it somewhere down the road. What I've been trying to do today is just making people understand that Garvey had a series of periods in Jamaica. His childhood, when his parents and his godfather were important, then his early youth, when he went towards nationalist politics under Dr. Love and Sandy Cox, and began to show what he could do in terms of starting his first newspaper and editing the newspaper was called Our Own, that was put out by Sandy Cox. And that Our Own thing, that's the English for Sinn Féin, right? So they were interested in what was happening elsewhere in the world and the empire. And then he leaves Jamaica 1909 to 1911, something like that, and he goes to edge of the Caribbean, Central America places. He goes to Puerto Rico and he goes to Panama, and he's active in those places, puts out newspapers in the language of the people as well as in English, the nation, the national. Returns to Jamaica, and his cultural activism emerges. That's primarily what he did in the period between getting back to Jamaica in 1911 and leaving Jamaica in 1912. Elocution contests, debates, etc., etc., etc. And then he comes to the UK, 1912 to 1914. He returns to Jamaica in 1914, has a 2-year period, and at the start of his return, July 1914, he announces to the African world that I, Marcus Garvey, have prepared myself seriously to do something with and for you. And he says grandly that he's going to do something in education, in the arts, in economics, in culture, in the state, everything, right? The Universal Negro Improvement Association was conceived of by Garvey as an African world government, a government of Africans in the world of ourselves. That's how it was conceived of. And there's another element to the title. That other element is African Communities League. Garvey knew, and I believe this would be important, that we Africans have to organize as communities in the places where we are, right? We do a pretense. We pretend, for example, that Jamaica is an African state. It's not. It's an out of many one state. It's a multiracial state. And Africans there can only make it into an African state if we organize first as African communities and do the work with ourselves, first of all, so that we can impose. We have numbers, we have a right to it, so that we can impose our interests on those states and turn them into African states, which they are not at the moment. In Jamaica, while I was there a few years ago, somebody, back to Liberty Hall, proposes to bring Winnie Mandela. And that state that's supposed to be African, you know what they said? We are not entertaining any criminal. That's what the Ministry of Tourism in Jamaica, I'm not making it up. Huh?
How long ago was that?
1908, no, 2008, 2009, somewhere like that. Right? Not all that long ago. Right? Those states say we can't do too much around Garvey in the curriculum because the curriculum is Caribbean, and those other Caribbean states are not up to allowing us to do what we want to do on Garvey. And so at the examination level and do next to nothing. There's a course in UWI, which I didn't start, which I used to teach. I taught on for a while. It was actually designed by Professor Rupert Lewis, who is a Garvey'ite. So, 1914 to 1916, in Jamaica, doing work to try to establish the UNIA. This grand vision, institutionally well designed, ideologically well conceived, but it can't work in Jamaica because the people then don't have the resources to make it work. So he goes off to the States, and everything falls into place. There's wicked opposition, there's spies everywhere, there's destructive forces in operation, but despite all of that, the UNIA becomes, in practice, what it is in name, a universal African movement, a universal movement of Africans for our own liberation, operating out of self-love, self-respect, economic cooperation. That movement funded all of the economic activities that Garvey conceived, but it also funded the Liberia project. A whole heap of money went into it. You know why it failed? It didn't fail because it was well planned, you know. It failed because the Americo-Liberians, the Africans who went back to Liberia, were running things in Liberia and they never want Garvey there upsetting things. So when they were telling Garvey to come, they were already under instructions from the white people. Make him come, teach him things, and kick out him people. Right? That's what actually happened. That's how the Liberia project crumbled. Not because there's anything wrong with it, but because it couldn't work in that place, dominated by black people who were already the agents of white folk. Liberia is the first neo-colony on the African continent. The first African neo-colony is actually Haiti. The Haitians did a grand revolution, and then white power transformed Haiti into the first neo-colony. They did that by insisting that the black people pay the white people compensation for having won their freedom. And then they imposed on Haiti an internal class whose business it was to take the money from the people at the bottom, keep some for themselves, and give the white people the rest. That's what neo-colonies in effect are. Haiti was the first one, and on our side of the Atlantic, Liberia was the first one on the continent of Africa. And that is why the Liberia project failed. It failed because white power told some black people who were well disposed towards them anyway to make sure it mashed up and thief as much as they can from Garvey and kick them out, which is what exactly they did. Alright, so Garvey gets back to Jamaica, 1927. Massive welcome. This is just some massive welcome. The Gleaner says how thick the crowd was on the ground. Never seen nothing like that at any time in Jamaica, in Kingston. Same in 20 when he came with the ship. And he sets out real difficulty. How can we get the resources that are in the States, in the UNIA in the States, to be transferred to Jamaica? The American government said, no, can't happen. The British government stops things coming in through the post office, through the banks and so on. And they cripple Garvey economically. He has to depend on Jamaican local resources, and resources are not there. The people are keen. People are Garveyians, but them don't have the money. So, even so, he starts a party and he wins representation in the local authority. And even so, he gets control of an important property, Garvey'S farm, and makes it into a remarkable foundational cultural center that really does sit at the heart of the development of Jamaican popular culture in the post-war period. That's what Edelweiss Spark was between 27 and 34. Then he comes back, final period, to London. I'm going to do a talk on Garvey in London, that last period, talking about what he did, how he organized a university through his newspaper, how he ran classes in African philosophy from here, and so on and so forth. The whole story there to be told and explored. Importantly, and I haven't said anything about Mrs. Garvey's who are important, so one of these days, people talk about them all the time, so I may not need to, but when he got to London, he came with Amy Jakes, the second wife. They lived in Hammersmith. Things were hard, and the children had health issues. And so Amy Jakes didn't too like how things were running. And while Garvey was in Canada in 38, she picked up the children and went home with them. Right? Never tell Garvey. Right? And it turned out to be good for the children. They regained their health and got a good education in Jamaica, and both of them are successful men. But if they had stayed, it might have been different. As it happened, their father passed in 2 years later anyway, so we don't know how it would have worked out. She might have gone home then, but she went home not telling Garvey while he was in Canada, and he'd come back, and the wife and the picnic and gone to Jamaica. Very angry and hurt and wounded, as any father would be, and we have the correspondence, some of it anyway, between them and so on, so we know what she thought, and she talks about it as well. So that's Marcus Garvey. I've talked about more than just the Jamaican years, but I hope I've helped you to understand that Jamaica's first national hero, Marcus Garvey, did stuff in Jamaica, and that we should pay attention to those periods and understand what he did during those periods in jail. Childhood, about 11, 1912, 1914 to 1916, 1927 to 1934, Garvey's Jamaican period. Thank you. I want to leave that there. Thank you. Oh, sorry. There's one important thing that I left out that I must just say a word or two on. Everybody knows that there's supposed to be a connection between Garvey and Rastafari. And Rastafari is a Jamaican movement created by African Jamaicans. And so there are basically two stories. One asserts that Marcus Garvey was, during his period in the States in the 20s, the man who inspired Rastafari to come into being as the socio-religious movement that it became. Some Rastafari men and women say and tell that story. The other story is that Garvey didn't say what Rastafari believed he said, that he didn't point in the way that they say to His Imperial Majesty as the coming Prince and King and the returned Messiah. And in fact, Garvey was in Jamaica during the period of the emergence of Rastafari. And he is on paper writing to the Gleaner, not arguing against His Majesty, accepting to say that he does not believe and cannot support any idea that His Majesty is divine. And Garvey is in the Gleaner saying he does not believe in the divinity of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I. He said so in clear words, right? So there's no doubt about that. And Rastafari, who know that, don't do check for Garvey because they think that he was against His Imperial Majesty. And then there's one final thing which happens after Garvey left Jamaica. That whole thing is another talk. I've done it elsewhere at greater length. So what I'm doing now is summarizing and maybe making trouble for myself. But the other thing that happened is that in 1935, as everybody knows, Italy invaded Abyssinia, Ethiopia.
Then, at the time in question,
Garvey's black man started to come out round about that time. Remember, he's living in London now, came in 34. Garvey's response to the Italian rape of Ethiopia, and it was a rape. They used poison gas. They did all kind of horrible things to the Ethiopian people. Europeans are savages, right? And every opportunity they get to be savage, they are, right? I was seeing a documentary just today by somebody talking about how the Americans treated Africans, and they are in those places to the east of Australia, where there's a place called Bikini, and they planted a gigantic bomb in the middle of Bikini and exploded the people's island, right? And then they left them there for a while, then they took them off, and then they told them it was safe, and they put them back in there because they wanted to do an experiment on real human beings on what the effect of radiation is on people in a controlled experiment, right? And there came a time when they offered the people compensation. They offered them 100 and something million, which did nothing. It ran out very quickly, and the people are still suffering from the effect that the island is uninhabitable. The neighboring islands are also inhabitable, and so on. These people don't, right? You think they only did it to Indians when they gave them disease-ridden clothes, or and so it right here and now. This is what they do. All right. So in Ethiopia, Abyssinia, that's what they did. That's what the Italians did. And Garvey's black man is very strong in opposing Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. And then, at a certain moment in the evolving history, His Majesty is advised to leave Ethiopia, and he in fact comes into exile in Britain. And at that point, and for the first time, Garvey is critical of Haile Selassie as emperor, right? He never accepted his divinity at any stage, right? But he's for the first time critical of His Majesty as emperor. The page of the black man, I own the black man, and I know the exact page. And he says, war in Ethiopia, the emperor runs, right? Quote. And after that, Garvey has nothing good to say about His Imperial Majesty, because he doesn't believe that he should have left Ethiopia and come to England, that he should have stayed and run the liberation movement. That's my take on Garvey and Rastafari. And I want to leave it there. I'm perfectly prepared at some stage to come and do it at greater length. I do know the story, but it's not right to talk about Garvey's Jamaican years without actually touching on the history of Garvey and Rastafari, because it emerged as a movement during his last period in Jamaica. Thanks. Welcome.
Yeah, just before Mike comes back, just to thank everybody for coming again. And just again to reiterate that these meetings are put on by the African Congress Movement. It's an organization that has been around since 1974. Am I right here? I have two of the founder members of the organization, Brother Pepper and Brother Cecil. They are one of the founder members of this organization. The organization has been doing tremendous work for the last 42 years, as you can see. And apart from the branch here in London, there's branches in Manchester, Wolverhampton. So if anybody would like to know more about the PACM and what we do, you can come and speak to us after, and we will be able to fill you with more. We also run a YouTube channel that you can find out a lot more about the organization, things that we've done in the past. If you go to YouTube and just type in PACM TV, you'll be able to see a lot of things that we do. Now, these meetings, just like to say what we're doing next week. I already said next week we'll be showing the actual film of Garvey by Robert Hill. We showed it a few weeks ago, but it brought up a lot of debate basically, because a lot of people saying I was not aware of how controversial it was at the time it came out. Now I've been led, it was a very controversial thing. Robert Hill, as Brother Cecil saying, is not a Garveyite, and so he skewed the film in a way, put Garvey in rather a bad light. So we intend to show the film and specifically then point out the inaccuracies, because this film is being shown all over the place. Thousands of people must have watched it and believe what they saw. Now it's time that that is challenged and the truth is put out there, what's really. So that's next week. Then the week after that, I'm pleased to say we'll be having Runoko Rashidi here. Okay, Runoko Rashidi is a very extraordinary person. He travels basically wherever African people are, document, record, and let the world know. So he'll be talking about African presence in early Europe and Asia. So that's on the 17th. Everybody should have one of these on their chair. So they can see it's going to be here. You can see space is limited. So I'm warning people, get your tickets early. But we don't want a Tony Bravo situation where on the day people turn up and make the turn a lot of people away. Just could not hold them in here. So Runoko Rashidi, they're coming up on the 17th. Then on the 24th, we'll be having a brother by the name of Lyndon Westart, and he'll be looking at diabetes. This brother actually suffered from diabetes. He was diagnosed with diabetes, and he managed to overcome it without medication. Once he got his diagnosis, he went away, he done his research, and he managed to, put his diabetes in remission, got rid of it, and he'll be here to tell us how he managed to do it. So that's on the 24th. And Syria, of course, just started their African Zodiac applied by Brother Shamari. Just started. Saturday was the first. It's going on for 6 weeks. So if anybody's interested, just come along Saturday at 1 p.m. It's 1 to 3 p.m. each Saturday. Yeah? And where's Sister Legit? Brother Omawale, Sister Legit, could you just pass the collection board? We're coming around. Just give generously, whatever you can. It all helps to keep this place going. Yeah? So now I'll go over to Brother Pepper Pie.
Teach us about the history. And I remember one of the sessions when the Shonghai was an African woman with 2 violins in blood. And she told us that this was from not being in the Sahara of thousands of years ago. So this is what we do as Africans. We were fashioned to ages. So the information that is passed down to us is very important, and we know a lot more more part, to put our hands together and show a big Pan-African thank you to Br Cecil. So we now vote for question number 42. It's a very special evening. I've got my daughter who from the States, her husband who's my son, my 2 grandchildren, I've been husband who's sitting here. So it's a Pan-African gathering of international dimension. As Br Cecil said, God started in Jamaica, blossomed in the USA. My daughter and her mother, Bonnie, living in the US. So it's a really great. So we know for questions.
Yes. I saw your hand way at the back there, my brother.
No, you know what it was, Cecil? I was just going to say you're going to be in for questions and answers, but you preempted me. So.
You have one.
No, the audience has.
Yeah,
has many,
okay.
has many.
No, I got half an hour or so that I'm prepared to answer any question that people have in that time. Yes, my sister.
It was said that if it wasn't for Garvey, we would know that His Majesty was going to be cut down. Because how did you get that information if it wasn't connected with Africa?
No, it's important that you understand what I said. It's widely believed that during his time in the States, Marcus Garvey predicted explicitly the crowning of His Imperial Majesty. There's debate around that. If there's some Bible passages like talking about, and the basis on which it is thought is easy to understand, right? So that's one position. The other position is that Garvey didn't intend any of this to apply to His Imperial Majesty, and there is some credibility to that, because Garvey at no stage believed in the divinity of His Majesty and the possibility of him coming not just to be crowned as emperor, but to be crowned as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, and all of that stuff, a divine entity. Garvey wasn't, it's not conceivable that Garvey was making that prediction in that way, because it's not in his. Garvey was a Christian. He ended up as a Roman Catholic, and he did not believe in the divinity of His Imperial Majesty, and cannot have predicted in any way, shape or form the coming of His Imperial Majesty as a divine entity on the throne of Imperial. He didn't predict that. Yes, sir.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that I wanted to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
The first one about Garvey disagreeing with Emperor Selassie and certain things that he did. For me, when Selassie was coronated in 1930, and obviously knowing that he joined the League of Nations, which stipulated that if any sovereign nation would come under attack, that all other sovereign nations would have to aid Ethiopia. And a lot of the Europeans wasn't in agreement with Selassie joining the League of Nations. Selassie joined the League of Nations because he knew that that was one of the only, if not the only, free territory in Africa with an old monarchy and so forth. So, in England, where they have a monarchy, a much younger monarchy, but she has a parliamentary system that deals with her affairs for her, Selassie created the parliament and created all of the ministers and everything. So if Selassie would have stayed in Ethiopia, it would have been like chess. Once the king's gone, everything would have crumbled. So his purpose for going back to the League of Nations is, for me, and what precipitated afterwards in a form of World War II, that basically a lot of people, the Rastas, looked at that prophecy as prophecy, as that because what happened in Ethiopia led to the destabilization of the League of Nations and ultimately World War II. So for me, that's where the theology came into it. Like, oh, this is actually happening. This is seen in Revelations.
Yeah.
So what happened to Benito Mussolini, like as perceived as the beast, and that this lamb would overcome the beast? They saw it in real life terms.
Yeah.
So a lot of, for me, I didn't, when Selassie left Ethiopia and went back to the League of Nations and then took exile in England, he might not have overstood the whole situation of why Selassie made that move, because a lot of people didn't know why he made that move, but it revealed itself afterwards. Like, for example, when it said in the Times magazine, if it wasn't for this humble Ethiopian, World War II wouldn't have started. So for me, I think it being just circumstances of being in different places and not really understanding. The second thing was when you mentioned that a lot of Rastafarians some of them don't check for Garvey, because I could that doesn't really as a prophet or at the same level of anything that's there.
No man, only for Rasta don't check for Garvey.
Thank you.
Yeah?
Right, let me just say, right, that as a friend of, he died, Martin Plano. And Martin Plano, he checked for Garvey, but not in any way at the same level of His Imperial Majesty, because he knew what Garvey had said. He read The Gleaner, and he read Garvey's Black Man. Now, the prophetic role that some Rastafari ascribed to Garvey starts long before the coronation in 1930, which is correct. Of His Majesty there. They see the coronation as the fulfillment of a prophecy. And because Garvey had said, quoted, if you will, from some 1923, sometime like that, even in 1914 actually, he was talking about princes coming out of Ethiopia, because it's in the Bible, but it's not intended by him to apply to His Majesty. And I've told you already why. The reason is that this Christian Garvey did not conceive of any human being as a divine person. And he says so in the clearest terms in the early 1930s as the early Rastafari are beginning to make their move in Jamaica. He writes The Gleaner and says so. Right? And then you're right about why His Majesty left and the importance of the contact with the League of Nations and the impact of Ethiopia in terms of discrediting the League and so on and so forth. All of that is true. And you can use that as confirmation of His Majesty's divinity, or you can just see it as the unfolding of history. And so those are the Marcus Garvey, in the pages of The Black Man, said in terms, I'm not guessing, I'm quoting, war in Ethiopia the emperor runs. And after that, repeat, he had nothing favourable to say about or for him. That's just how it was. Yes, sir.
Yes.
No, I'm seeing this brother before the sister and then, yeah.
Yeah, well, Marcus Garvey would have known that Selassie was a crown emperor.
Yeah.
Because he was
the crown prince.
Yeah. He was Prince Regent from 1916 and became Negus, which means king, in 1928. And he was also heir to the throne. So Marcus Garvey would have known that. Well, sometimes the powers that be in the universe make man say some things which become prophetic, which they never even say. So, things that Marcus Garvey said, other people will pick it up and run with it.
Yes.
But going back to, Marcus Garvey was a very arrogant man. Very arrogant. That's why I lose all the part.
I think of him as confident, not arrogant. But
no, he's arrogant to us. He's arrogant. You see, you have confidence and you have arrogance. Arrogance will make you lose a whole heap of friends. Confidence will make them follow you.
Yes.
You understand? No, him attack go Selassie around. Why never stay America and fight?
Well, he couldn't. They deported
I
him.
mean, him couldn't. Him could have been making people them rise up and fight. Just like how he Selassie fight the Italian them.
They deported. What did they do?
Him could have made them fight like how them fight at Haiti. You understand?
I don't know about that. This
Well,
first
him
time-
have how
first
much
time I'm hearing
million
that
leader.
competition.
Him have how much million people in them organization. He have how much million who support him otherwise.
Yes.
And him couldn't draw a revolution. But him a talk about a man who have a face gas, mustard gas, from aeroplane. With most of the people, them never even have a rifle. You understand?
What would African Americans have had to face had they taken on the United States state in defense to keep Garvey in the United States of America? What would they have had to face?
Why anybody have a face in a war?
No, I mean, right. So, all right. I hear that point. I don't think I'm all that impressed by